Hello and welcome to this video on question paper preparation for National 5 Design and Manufacture. Before we get started, there's a number of key revision resources that you should be aware of. Google Classroom is one of the most important ones. That's where you'll find all of your revision resources being posted by your teacher, as well as links to SVA past papers. But you'll also find in the classwork tab all of your work organised by topic. This means you can look for specific topics and revise them using the activities and notes that you've previously used in class. You'll also find links to things like WordWall and Quizlet that might also be helpful. Another link that will have been put on your Google Classroom by your teacher is a link to the Achieve Learning site, along with sign up and registration details on how to get started with that. On the Achieve site, you'll find links to notes, descriptors of different topics, as well as some practice questions. You'll find videos that link to other learning, and you'll find links directly to specific past paper questions on that topic. Finally, the @LHS Technologies YouTube channel has a range of videos that you can revise with. These videos include ones like this, which will show you example and model answers of how to respond to past paper questions. The National 5 Design and Manufacture paper has a number of key topics and sections. Workshop manufacturing is one of the largest at the start of the paper, covers all the workshop activities you would do and the different materials you would use within a workshop setting. Design factors and design issues, so covering aesthetics, ergonomics, function, etc., but also things like research techniques, evaluation techniques, graphic and modelling techniques can be part of this section as well. Commercial manufacturing processes, which will cover things like die casting, injection moulding and the materials associated with these processes. And then finally the impact of manufacturing, which will look at how manufacturing processes impact upon society, how they've developed in terms of CAD/CAM, and things like knockdown fittings and standard components. So the first question we're going to look at is one on workshop manufacturing. This question asks, describe how the corner rebate joint could be marked and cut out accurately. You must refer to workshop tools in your answer, and you may use sketches to illustrate your answer. So important points to remember before you start answering this question. It's a describe question, so it means you're describing each step, you're not just listing them. You can refer to marking out stages or cutting stages, but you have to mention the tools that you use at each stage. And you can't just use sketches, it's a written answer as well as sketches. You don't have to use sketches, but it's definitely recommended that you do. So some of the stages you can include in your answer are measuring the length and position of the joint with a rule or with a steel rule. Now it's important to mention here that steel rules can only be used for measuring, not for marking out. The next point is marking the width of the joint with a tri-square, so that's you marking the different lines across the material using a tri-square to show how wide the joint is. In this case the joint would probably only have one line because you'd be working in from the end. You then get marking the depth of the joint with a marking gauge, so scoring that line on to show how far down the joint would actually be cut. And then a smaller, less common stage might be using a marking knife to create a little kerf, a groove for the saw. The cutting stages would be cutting the depth of the joint with a tenon saw. Some candidates sometimes mention a coping saw, but the correct tool for this would be a tenon saw. Making a relief cut with a tenon saw, that's an extra cut somewhere in the waste wood to reduce the amount of material that would be chiselled out at one time. Removing the waste wood with a bevel edge chisel. You would be able to say just chisel at this point, but a bevel edge chisel is the correct chisel. And then levelling the base of the joint with a hand router, sometimes called a granny's tooth. A question like this is worth 4 marks and would normally take about 6 minutes to complete. What you're going to do now is pause the video, take the 6 minutes to complete the question, and then unpause the video when you're ready to see the solution. So let's now look at an example answer for this question. The candidate's written, to cut the corner rebate joint, you would first measure the position of the joint from the end of the material with a steel rule, and then measure the width of the joint. You would then mark the width of the joint using a tri-square. Using a marking gauge, you would score a line to show the depth of the joint. You would use a tenon saw to cut down to the depth of the joint before removing the waste wood with a bevel edge chisel. So let's see where the marks would be awarded. The first sentence talks about measuring the position of the joint from the end of the material with a steel rule, so that would pick up a mark, and they've also talked about measuring the width of the joint. So that whole first sentence would definitely attract 1 mark. You would then mark the width of the joint using a tri-square. Well, that's them talking about using a tri-square to mark out exactly how wide the joint was, and in this case there probably would only be 1 line because it's at the end of the material, so that picks up a mark. They've talked about setting the depth or scoring the depth using a marking gauge, so again mentioning the tool and talking about the process, so that picks up a mark. And then in the last statement they talk about using the tenon saw to cut it and removing waste wood with a bevel-edged chisel. There's actually 2 separate marks in there, one for using the tenon saw to cut it, and one for removing the waste wood with a bevel-edged chisel, but that actually takes the candidate more than over the 4 marks. So they don't get any extra marks, but they definitely get the 4 available. Had one of those statements been wrong or incorrect, because it's a described question, they would have still been able to pick up the 4 marks. So for example, had they not mentioned the steel rule in the first sentence and not picked up a mark there, they would have still had enough to get the 4 marks. Remember, you do need to mention the tools at each stage to get a mark, and the stages really should be in a logical order. Steel rules again are for measuring and not marking. So let's now look at a different section of the paper, this time on design factors and specifically aesthetics. The question asks you to describe how the clocks compare aesthetically. You should compare 3 different aspects. So again, it is a described question, so it means you're describing and not just listing. And when the question contains compare, you must make a comparison between at least 2 of the products. So for example, clock A has a circular shape, but clock C has a cuboid shape. Here you're referencing aesthetics because you're talking about shape, and you're mentioning 2 differences between clock A and clock C, which allows you to pick up a mark. Compare questions only really appear when it's aesthetics. So when it's an aesthetics question, there are different aspects that you can focus on: colour, shape or form, contrast, texture, pattern and proportion. You can also make reference to things like fashion and style and materials, but you do need to be careful that you link it to one of the points above. So for example, clock C has a more modern form, but clock B has a more old-fashioned traditional form. If you say things like clock B is old-fashioned, it can be harder for the marker to award you the marks. So this question is worth 3 marks, which would mean it should take you about 4.5 minutes within an exam setting. Now hopefully in other parts of the paper you might have banked more time because you're able to answer questions in a quicker speed, which means that even though we're saying 4.5 minutes, it could take you longer to do this sort of question because it is more challenging. This sort of question is what we would call one of our A or B discriminator questions, which means it's got a higher level of challenge. So take the 4.5 minutes or however long you need to complete this question, pause the video and then come back to watch the answer. So let's now look at an example answer for this question. The candidate's written, clock A has a circular shape, but clock C has a rounded square shape. Clock B is a vibrant, striking pink colour, but clock B is a more sophisticated, natural brown colour. Clock A has a large face, which is in proportion with the size of the clock, but the face of clock B is smaller and not in proportion. Clock B has a contrast between the gold and wooden materials, but clock C has little contrast, with the numbers and face both being pink. Now this is a far more complicated answer, and again with it being a described question, even if statements are wrong within it, you can bypass them and hopefully pick up marks later on when you're working as a marker. Looking at the first sentence, they're talking about shape and describing it as circular, comparing it then with clock C that has a kind of rounded edge but still square shape. They're talking about shape, they've made a comparison, it's a valid statement and it picks up a mark. They've used some more adjectives to describe the fact that clock B is pink, using things like vibrant and striking. These don't pick up additional marks, but it helps you put into picture for the marker exactly what you're talking about. And again, they've made a contrast with clock B, talking about it being a more sophisticated natural brown material, which in this case is wood. They then talk about proportion and the change in size between clock A having a large face, which is in proportion with the size of the object, whereas clock B having a much smaller face in the kind of top right corner of clock C. Finally, they talk about clock B and there being a contrast between the gold and wooden materials. So in this case, although they're talking about materials, they have mentioned contrast, whereas they're showing that there's little contrast with clock C because everything within it is pink. Now again, this candidate has overstated responses. They've put more down for the answer than they need. It's only worth 3 marks, but they've got 4 valid statements. So they're able to pick up all 3 marks and would have actually had 1 to spare as well. Just remember that for aesthetics, you're describing different aspects of how a product looks, and you do only need to compare if it says compare. The areas to focus on first are always colour and then shape or form, depending on whether it's 2D or 3D. And the other one that's always good to refer to is contrast, because you can link that back to things like colour, and sometimes you can pick 2 marks up for one statement. So the next section we're going to look at is the commercial manufacturing section. Now this gets its own section, section 2, and is worth a total of 20 marks. Now the questions are split up into smaller sections, but typically at the start, either question 8 or question 9 is based around a product with different materials and different manufacturing processes. In this example, you're given a parasol with a metal base, or can be used with a plastic base as well. For part A of the question, you're asked to specify a metal for the base and explain why it's suitable, and a plastic for the base and explain why that's suitable. In the most recent papers, you're given a list to pick from, and you have to use the list of materials provided. Now in some cases, there could be more than one option, but you have to pick the most suitable. And in most of the example questions in the past papers, it should be clear which one is the most suitable if you know the material properties. The best way to attempt these questions is you think of the properties that are needed by the product rather than the properties of the materials. So looking at the product itself, what properties does that product require to be successful? So each of these questions are given a mark each. And in this case, because they are shorter questions and you're given the options, you're probably looking at about a minute a mark for these questions to allow you to build up more time for other sections of the question paper that might require more minutes. So for this question, select the most appropriate material for each base from the list provided and state why they would be suitable. You need to give a different property for each one of the products. So you can't use the same reason or same property for the metal base as you would for the plastic base. Pause the video just now to attempt the question. So let's now look at some candidate responses for this question. First of all, it's important to consider what properties are required by this product. It's a parasol, so it has to hold the umbrella, which means it requires weight, and it also has to be used outdoors, which means it has to be resistant to the weather. Using these properties, we can start to look at the metal base, thinking first of all which one is the heaviest of the metals. Now copper, very expensive and very lightweight. Cast iron, inexpensive, easy to cast and very heavy. Aluminium, good strength to weight ratio, but again very light. So in this instance, cast iron would be the most appropriate choice. Now it's suitable because it's heavy and it will help weigh down the parasol. As for the plastic base, acrylic would be too light and too brittle. Polypropylene, good flexibility and good weather resistance. Urea formaldehyde, durable but prone to cracking and only really used for electrical casings. So in this case it would be polypropylene, and it would be suitable because it's water and weather resistant, and that will make sure it's durable in outdoor conditions. So that's why it's important to think of the properties that are needed by the product to help you answer. Thinking about the properties that are required rather than the properties of the material first makes a big difference. The question continues on and it asks you to state 2 identifying features of rotational moulding which would be used to manufacture the plastic base. You do this for 2 marks, and then you also need to name a process that could have been used to manufacture the following parts that are shown in the image. So what process would be used to manufacture the metal base, and which would be used to manufacture the plastic cap. Now lots of processes have similar identifying features, and you have to choose those that are most relevant to the process. There's also a lot of different processes that can be used for different products, so again it's important to choose the most appropriate. Now at this point, you should pause the video and attempt to answer the 2 questions, and then when you're ready to see the answer, unpause the video. So for the first question, you're asked to state 2 identifying features of rotational moulding. Now because it's a state question, you are required to get these correct in the order. If you put more than 2 answers and the first or second is wrong, you only get the marks for the questions in the order you answer them. So for example, if part 1 of your answer was wrong, but part 2 and 3 were correct, you would still only achieve 1 mark for the second part of the response. In this case, the candidate has answered the product would be hollow because it has been rotational moulded. The product would have a split line around it. Now these are both correct identifying features. One of the easiest ways to tell if something is rotational moulded is because it's a hollow product. Hollow products, with the exception of bottles, are almost exclusively rotational moulded. Another clear identifying feature of rotational moulding is that it would have a split line around it which shows where the mould separates. Now, split lines are one of the most common identifying features that can be found on things that have been blow moulded, rotational moulded, injection moulded, so it's a good one to have in your memory to use for different processes. For naming a process that could have been used to manufacture each of the following parts, the metal base, really your two options are sand casting and die casting. Now, just because of the scale of the item, it's most likely that this would be sand casted. And for the plastic cap, it's quite a small, intricate part made of solid plastic, and again, for most commercial products, injection moulding is one of the default processes that are used. So again, it's always one to go to as a default. Thanks for watching this video, and remember to use Google Classroom, the Achieve Learning website, and at LHS Technologies on YouTube to continue with your revision.